Welcome everybody to the next React Native show podcast. Today we have a special edition, which is also a React Native EU panel, and today with me we have very special guests that will be answering some of the most interesting questions that you have been asking during the React Native conference. So maybe let's do a quick introduction of every guest, starting from my left side. So I guess the first person to go is Eloy. Eloy, if you could introduce yourself. What are you doing at your day job? What are you doing with React Native on a daily basis? And essentially everything that you'd like our listeners to know about you.
Ooh, that's an interesting question, Mike. So I'm Eloy. I currently work at Microsoft, and I work on their React Native needs in Office, which day-to-day means that I'm working on getting macOS React Native up to speed with the other versions that exist. And also helping out the community with some things like getting the releases out, etc. Otherwise, let's see. I worked on CocoaPods, dependency manager in the iOS, macOS space. So I have a lot of I've always had a lot of interest in the where native meets scripting other languages, and that's how I found my way to React Native when I worked at Artsy.
Interesting. Yeah, I've seen a couple of your recent PRs around native code. I'm not gonna spoil that work because there is some exciting stuff coming up, so we'll probably learn about that in the nearest future. Thank you for that. So the next person is Parashuram. Ram, now it's your time.
Hey everyone, my name is Ram. I'm an engineering manager at Facebook, and I'm currently working in Oculus. Oculus, if you haven't heard, is the virtual reality headset that Facebook produces. And at Oculus, I'm mostly working on React and React Native based 3D systems for 2D systems for a 3D environment. Before this, I used to be on the React Native team where I was working on the re-architecture of React Native, specifically on turbo modules, and have done a lot of work on performance. I've actually been associated with React Native even before I was at Facebook. Before Facebook, I was at Microsoft. And if you folks remember Code Push, I was the PM on Code Push trying to help people push their code faster. And I also helped build the VS Code plugin for React Native. Building mobile applications for iOS and Android using JavaScript is something that's always near and dear to my heart. In fact, I'm also a Apache core committee member of the Apache Cordova project, or more commonly known as PhoneGap project. And during my time at Microsoft, I've done Xamarin. So as you can see, I've played around with all the technologies, which is not Java and Objective-C, that you can use to build mobile applications. So that's me.
That's really exciting. And I think when I think about the first time we met, I think that was on a conference in the US when we were talking about Code Push. Actually, that was back when you were in Microsoft. That's been quite exciting times when Code Push was just starting. So that's been quite a while ago now, I think. Okay, thank you. So the next speaker is Monica. Monica, if you could tell us a few words about yourself and what you are doing with React Native on a daily basis.
Sure. Hi all. So my name is Monica. I'm a software engineer at Major League Soccer, and I'm currently working in a few exciting projects within the league, but mostly focusing a lot in mobile development with our MLS app. Our app is what we call a hybrid app, but about 70% of it is built in React Native, and then the rest Swift and Kotlin, and that's how I use my time at work.
Nice. That's pretty exciting. And how do you like Kotlin compared to Java?
I think I like it better than Java, definitely.
What I like about it is the automatic conversion when you copy and paste the stuff to the JetBrains editor. That's a real killer feature for me. Yeah, okay. Thank you about this. So the next and the last guest on our podcast today is Kudo. Kudo, if you could tell us a few words about yourself, that would be awesome.
Okay. Hello, I'm Kudo. I'm a software engineer of CloudMosa. CloudMosa, day job is about development of browser. So I'm really a part-time for React Native because my day job totally not related to React Native at all. For the part-time, I have some side projects such as React Native V8, and I also previous JavaScript core maintainer, and this time I have a React Native Skia. So, and from the day job, I got most familiar with Chromium code base because we are doing browser based on Chromium. So I got a lot of familiar with Chromium code base. That's why I do VA or Skia Flutter as well.
Nice. That's really exciting. And I think I already said that during the conference, but when we met for the first time, I remember your messages in those, C++ related channels on the Discord community. That's been always blowing my mind for a while. I even thought that you were working at Facebook because the amount of comments about turbo modules made me think that you are maybe actually working on that. And then it turned out you were actually external contributor. So respect for that. All right, so thank you for introducing. As you can see, we have a really, really great guest today to talk about React Native. So maybe let's start with a React Native EU question. How did you like the conference? What was the most exciting thing about the conference that you liked so far? And we can start from Eli first.
Hey, I really liked that it was online, of course. As you know, I am always remote, and also I think wasn't it the first React Native EU that I broke my I stopped doing any conferences, and then I figured like, okay, well,
Yes.
I'll do this. Yeah.
I was proud of myself that I can convince you.
Yeah. So I really like not having to travel and doing it remotely. So I think that was definitely the upside part for me. The talks that stood out to me, that wasn't necessarily one that stood out the most to me. I just really enjoy hearing other people talk about React Native because, as you know, I work alone here in the Netherlands, and it is fun to have these people talk. I enjoy being at the conference, talking with people about what they're doing day to day, and that's what I enjoy most about the conferences. And having this conference around this technology that is so exciting to me. So I think that's the best part to me.
Awesome. Who wants to go next?
I'll go. Well, I have to go with Eli's opinion, and it was amazing that it was an online conference. Having the idea of having people from all over the world, just like being able to participate was very interesting. I really enjoyed the quality and technicality of all the talks. If I were to pick my favorite, I think I would go perhaps with Modernizing React Native's JavaScript by, I think it was Eloy as well, White. I can't remember how to pronounce his name, but I'm sorry for that. So I usually love, like one of the reasons why I go to these conferences is just to look for some deep dives into complex, relevant topics. And I think this is something that this talk in particular did. His talk was really descriptive, easy to digest, and definitely just enlightening in many things. So I'll just pick that.
Awesome. Ram or Kudo? Who's gonna?
I can go next. I can probably go next. I think one of my favorite things about conferences is I usually don't attend conferences for the talks themselves, but for meeting people. I think like most conferences have talks recorded and posted online, but it's that whole connection that you have with your fellow developers who are working on like similar problems, trying to listen to them and figure out what kind of similar problems you have. That has been something that's always been like of interest. And honestly, when Mike pitched this whole idea of, hey, we're going to do a React Native EU, I was a little skeptical to start off with. I was not sure if it's going to have the same essence of the conference. I should say that I was pleasantly surprised. In fact, it was very interesting to see how on the Slack channel, people were talking to each other, and there was this whole set of side conversations that were happening, people helping out each other. So I can actually say that I did feel that sense of community. And honestly, React Native is a very inclusive and welcoming community, and the Slack channel was an embodiment of that. Also, I don't know if many people who watch React Native EU know this, but Mike, I'm probably going to let out a secret. The talks were all recorded. They were not actually happening online. So that did relieve a good pressure from the speakers.
Yeah.
And I think what happened was that effectively freed the speakers up and helped them answer the questions as the questions were popping up during the talk. So like the Slack was super active, and the whole community building was my favorite part about React Native EU online.
Yeah, and I have to totally agree with you on that point. Usually we are super stressed when it comes to organizing this conference here in Wrocław, but because, some of the stuff was already prepared up front, we were able to also have slightly less, I would say, intense time during that week. So definitely something that we will be, missing from the next year if it's going to be happening on site. Cool. Kudo, what about you?
For me, I like the topic because there is a diversity from architecture, from JavaScript, day-to-day development, GraphQL, and about the animation. For me, I like the animation topic very well, especially inspire me for the animation differences between web and mobile. That is really inspiration topic, and I also thank to the conference about it's a virtual conf because I used to stay with my family, and with this chance I could have a talk in this year.
Yeah, I think we even talked last year when I tried to convince you to submit a CFP, and you said traveling will be impossible, and this year, it was finally possible. So really happy that we made it. All right. So we are warmed up. We are ready to dive deep into the first group. So just for the record, I have grouped the questions into 3 groups, and these groups are the new architecture of React Native, multiple platforms, and general development. So just general questions that people were interested to have answers for. So let's move on to the new architecture of React Native. So just to quickly recap, last year, React Native team announced a lot of changes to the core of React Native that addresses a lot of challenges that we are facing when it comes down to building applications. And that includes Turbo Modules, which is a new implementation of native modules for better performance and synchronous access. CodeGen to ease creation of native modules by synchronizing the type definitions and method declarations between native and JavaScript. GSI, which is JavaScript interface, and it is a unified, lightweight, sort of general purpose API for any JavaScript virtual machine. And it enables every other piece of the re-architecture, and is what, for example, makes Hermes integration very easy. And easy is obviously relative here. And Fabric, which is just the UI re-architecture to take full advantage of these features and concurrent React architecture. So while this work is still in progress, we can see a lot of these already in the open source, and I think it would be great to sort of go over the latest updates in the RIA, and I think that questions from our audience might be a great starting point to our discussion. So the first question that I have here is, what is the status of the re-architecture, and what are the changes that are already shipped, and when do we expect to have an update on the rest of them? And I think the best person here would be Ram, that is, even wearing Facebook t-shirts, so that tells it all.
Sure. So I think this has been a question that people have been asking, and I can clearly see how people can't wait to get their hands on the new architecture. But I want to be amply careful here about talking about there is no release for a new architecture, in the sense that there'll not be one single date where it's things stop and suddenly React Native switches over to the new architecture. Our initial plan was definitely trying to get it out in 2020, but unfortunately COVID hit. A lot of people, their productivity kind of went down. And as a result, we may not be able to hit 2020. We are looking at 2021 as something that where this can get out. But I mean, I don't have a specific date in mind, but let me also lay down what does releasing it really mean. So let me talk about a little bit on what's happening in terms of how fast you're going it internally, and then talk about what's available externally. So internally, I think on the main Facebook app, we are actually testing Fabric. We are testing Turbo modules. And honestly, JSI is pretty much the way to go for both Fabric and Turbo module. All of our native modules are code-gen. In fact, we also retro code-gen the existing modules. There's Turbo module spec and stuff for existing modules also. So the testing is heavily underway. We are seeing some really exciting results, both in terms of performance and in terms of stability. And I think one of our biggest motivations here is to ensure that the transition is smooth and stable. More importantly, like people's apps don't start crashing, and that's why we are being like exceedingly careful. We have also started to roll out Fabric and Turbo modules to internal apps. For example, the Oculus companion app that I work on, we are starting to roll out Turbo modules in it. Fabric is a little bit harder because we wanted to do it screen by screen, and for that you need native navigation, which we are trying to move to. And this is a similar story with all standalone applications. So I think the best way to think about it is internally in Facebook apps, we are slowly starting to roll out Fabric and Turbo modules, like ironing out the issues and any edge cases that we encounter. As far as open source is concerned, you'd actually be surprised, but both Fabric and Turbo modules are out there. I think the biggest challenge is it's not buildable, and that's only because Facebook internally uses Buck. So all of our build scripts are reliant on Buck. Now, this is where I think we can use some help from the community, and I think someone did this for iOS, where they picked up the iOS Turbo modules in Fabric systems, wired it up into the Xcode build, and they were able to build it. We haven't done that on Gradle yet. So if someone is brave enough and wants to try this out, I would recommend this as a really good project where you play around with Gradle and enable Turbo modules and Fabric on RN tester, for example. It's not as hard as it looks. It's basically a bunch of magic around Gradle scripts and Android.mk, the C++ wrapper. So that's the current state of the world. A lot of code is out there. I think Eli also spoke about code generation. And I think it is in a state where you can try it out, test it out, but I'm not sure if I would recommend it for production yet, mostly because it's not officially supported.
Yeah. Thanks for answering that. And actually, you would be surprised. And I mean, I'm not surprised because I've been there already. How quickly sometimes it might be, how easy it sometimes might be to kind of release some of these internal pieces into React Native for iOS. For example, on the Hermes side, compiling it for iOS is theoretically just doing some changes to the CMake, which on its own is very hard. But I was kind of surprised that essentially the code is just C++. So as long as you compile it, it theoretically can run. So not a lot of magic there inside, as someone would think. Awesome. So that brings me to the next question, where I could track the progress of that in the future, for example.
I think Monica also wanted to answer this, but let me quickly give a spiel of the discussions repository and the history, which I probably haven't spoken about. So I think almost 1 year ago when I was in the React Native team, I realized that there was a lot of discussions that are happening one-off, and one of our goals in the React Native team was to be inclusive and ensure that every discussion is transparent and people understand the rationale behind what's happening. That's the reason why we created this repository called Discussions and Proposals, where people, anyone in the world can submit a proposal, people can critique it, look at what can be implemented, and then go ahead and implement it. So we have this proposal called Discussions and Proposals, and there are issues related specifically to Turbo modules and to Fabric. That's where most of our updates are happening. Unfortunately, those issues could also be noisy because usually for every single update, there's 10 comments asking, "Hey, when is it ready?" So you might want to add on your noise filtering in there, but I think those are probably the best places where you can look at. It's also a place where I'd recommend if you're experimenting with Turbo modules, for example, just go add your status there and tell people, "Hey, here's what I've tried out," and people might come asking you.
I think also that if you allow me to jump in addition to what Ram just said, intuitively the first place that I particularly go and I will recommend people who's just getting into is, of course, the React Native repo, where we also have a bunch of issues being discussed, and the React Native community repos. In particular, with the React Native community repo, I found them very useful, especially the releases section. I believe, and correct me, Ram, if I'm wrong, is one of the most reliable places to go, in regards of staying up to date with status reports and all what's going on with React Native overall. And then just the usual, just chain logs and then release notes from your team at Facebook. I think it's also, just tracking all those will be pretty effective in just keeping, any developer up to date.
Cool. So what is the feature you're most excited about?
I'm assuming you're asking me. Okay, so we've been talking about how big this new re-architecture of React Native will be, or is kind of the process of being. And of course, there are a lot of things that will be definitely game changers in the way we develop apps. But if I have to pick one, I'm definitely going to go with turbo modules. This new feature that pretty much tackles, the most in terms of performance and safety. And I really like the idea of having tape safety between native code in JavaScript, and particularly for us at MLS. This is really important because we do have a fair amount of native modules and integrations with third-party providers. So, the overhead reduction that Turbo Modules introduces when calling methods from the JavaScript side is something that is really, really going to help us with performance, among with the faster startup when initializing our application. So definitely Turbo Modules for me.
Nice. I like that. I like that as well. Anybody else want to chime in here?
For me, it's probably going to be JSI because JSI is like the fundamental layer that's on which all of these things are built. And you'd actually be surprised, but all the other hybrid mobile app development platforms have a story similar to JSI. For example, if you look at NativeScript, NativeScript actually has a way to generate all of these JavaScript files based on templates. Like you take a Java class, it automatically generates all the methods and exposes them to JavaScript. And the mechanism they use is something very, very similar to JSI. In fact, JSI is also fundamentally the way a browser exposes its native APIs to your JavaScript layer. So looking at it in retrospect, maybe we didn't really need a bridge back then and we could have just used JSI, but I would vote for JSI mostly because it's like the founding block of the foundation of the entire system. And JSI is also already ready. So you can technically start using JSI right away, not just for Fabric or Turbo modules, but even let's say you're building your own JavaScript layer on top of a JavaScript engine. JSI would come in very handy.
Yeah.
I'm probably most excited about Fabric. Ever since initially when we explored React Native at Artsy, I think I spent a month trying to just get React Native to work with UIKit as I was used to it. And things like, a UI collection view or all those sorts, which with the Artsy app, there's so many images shown and you want to have fast scrolling and fast interactions that was kind of just, it felt like a necessity. In the end, I think the app works really well with React Native as it is. But, conceptually, I think having the ability to do such synchronous UI work will probably pay off in areas where it is noticeable that React Native is somewhat lacking.
For me, I also like Fabric. Feel more excited about Fabric as well. From my talk, I said that for third-party developer to have an out-of-tree platform is really, really a disaster because the upstream change is really change every day, and so especially for the individuals, it's really hard to have an out-of-tree platform. And now with the Fabric, most of core is also cross-platform. So I think it will benefit for the new platform and make it possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that brings us to the next section, which is kind of related to multi-platform React Native. So React Native running on other platforms. And at the end of the day, everybody who's been ever maintaining a separate React Native fork has been running through that kind of problem that you have mentioned. So from the very beginning, React Native was obviously about cross-platform, and while it shipped only with iOS and Android, or I think the Android was actually added a few months later, everybody knew that other platforms were eventually just a matter of time when somebody will start working on them. And this year, we've seen a lot of great contributions from our partners in the community, including Microsoft, on additional platforms such as Windows and surprisingly macOS. And we have received a lot of questions from our audience on that aspect and in the general direction of the framework in that area. So I think we can start off with a question, with the first question, which is kind of about sharing the code between mobile and web. So with the new platforms being released and becoming production ready, What opportunities do you envision when it comes to sharing code between mobile and web, traditional React and React Native targets, and desktop environments? Do these have a lot or something in common? And I think, Eloy, maybe you want to start, as you are representing actually the Microsoft here as well, and you are working on Windows and macOS ports of React Native.
Yeah, well, so I think, clearly any code that is not necessarily UI related or particularly dependent on the OS will be easily shared as plain JavaScript. So that is definitely already a win. I think I can imagine, like if I take the RT app as an example, porting it to desktop means that all the data layer would just work. So the pieces, and then when it comes to the UI, large pieces of the UI would work. I think people are familiar with Catalyst. It would be somewhat similar to that. You are able to leverage most of the UI, but obviously there are some paradigms that you only have on desktop and then some extra APIs. But I think it's always good to reiterate with React Native that it is not about writing once and deploying everywhere, but about learning once and writing everywhere. So this is similar in the case that you will have to put in some care to make an application on the desktop feel like a desktop application, which I think is what the users deserve, right?
Yeah.
For me, at CloudMosa, we had some React Native product. Our first product is about React Native Windows on WPF platform. It's not maintained at all because we have to support Windows 7. And being the first React Native product on desktop UI, we find it has some fundamental differences between mobile and desktop, and I find it is not covered in React Native yet. For example, at desktop UI, you have touchable. You used to have some mouse over feedback, and you also have to support drag and drop and multi-window support. How about if we could support multi-window in also the declarative ways, such as you have some app, and we have window 1, window 2, and below there are multiple views. So I think the desktop is not also covered from React Native, and we have some ways to do that. But in our experience, we had a desktop UI, and we had a Windows platform, and we also co-share for web and Android as well. So we have about 50% co-share rate. So I think it's really doable for React Native.
Nice. That's a very, very healthy number, I think, when it comes to code sharing.
Can I just touch on so it's definitely true, obviously, that things are still up in the air. But when it comes to, for instance, these pointer, like mouse events, whatnot, touchable, we are actually currently in the process of working with Facebook, both for the mobile platforms and for the React Native web platform, and for taking into account macOS and Windows, how to best provide a cross-platform API that works for all those.
Yeah, if I recon this, I think there is a discussion and proposals issue or PR about that, where it tries to kind of propose a standardized approach to handling these things. I think I've seen it before, and it's kind of aligned with what you were saying, so it might be interesting. If I find it out, we'll include it with the podcast for those of you who are interested in following up on this.
On this topic, I also wanted to up-level this discussion a little bit. I think while we've been focused mostly on React Native, because I understand that the audience here is about React Native, I think up-leveling this and talking about React platforms as a principle is also pretty interesting, because even in the React world, people have been writing custom renderers forever. This existed even before React Native itself was a platform. For example, we have had some really good demos from Ken Wheeler on React Music, for example. or even Nicholas on the React Native Web. Then I wrote a renderer around like React Web Workers, which is pretty much React Native. React 360 is actually like React Native in like a 360 environment. So I think we've been having this discussion around the principles of up-leveling it and calling it a React platform. And I think this is a blog post that Eloy published some time ago on the React Native blog, where he talks about the concept of, hey, the fact that React itself is a declarative UI paradigm kind of lends to this idea of adding multiple platforms. So with that in mind, if we were to up-level this discussion, the way I see it is React would be the top-level root node, and then things like React DOM, React Native Windows, React Native Android will all be siblings, all of them adding different levels of abstraction where you can say, hey, maybe the data fetching relay or the GraphQL components can be the same, but all you care about is the leaf node components that are different. I also want to be very, very, I want to ensure that we also understand that it's very critical to embrace the platform. Just because we are sharing code does not mean that we give up on the iOS-specific interactions or Android-specific interactions. So I think as people are thinking about code sharing, it's critical to ensure that your app looks and behaves like a native app. And I think that's the biggest promise that React Native brings to you.
Yeah, great, really great point. I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of React Native applications are performing and looking better than typical hybrid approaches, just because React Native has been always about embracing the platform. And it kind of brings us really nicely, which is a surprise, to the next question, which is about Flutter, which takes slightly different approach. And we've seen a great Kudo's talk on how we can render React Native components potentially to Skia, which brings us very close to what Flutter potentially is. And there's been a lot of developers talking about Flutter being superior because of being synchronous, and this is getting also kind of outdated as we are getting into the new architecture of React Native. So my question is, do you think this, and I'm talking about this kind of Skia renderer potentially and this synchronous access, is kind of an interesting achievement for the Flutter community, and would it make React Native a sort of interesting alternative and choice for them? What do you think about that?
I heard some people like Flutter because they don't like JavaScript. Okay, I don't have comment for that, and I don't think React Native Skia will inspire them. So for me, React Native Skia is also my self-challenge to learn more about Fabric, and I also want to prove that React Native could extend to another different platform such as Flutter. And the project current state is still far from production because we still miss some critical parts such as compositor, because we want to draw each view in our own. So, but we have some community to do this project, so maybe it will be possible to be a true product. And I would like to borrow some code from Flutter, so maybe the project will be React Native Flutter.
That would be good connection of very great keywords from the search engine perspective, I think. Ram, maybe you wanna kind of chime in from the synchronous and asynchronous perspective, because I know you've been always very passionate about these aspects of performance. So kind of interesting to see your perspective on that as well.
So I'm actually a pretty huge fan of Flutter, and I think the people who have developed Flutter have the architecture that they've come up is pretty interesting. In fact, if you think about it, React Native has always been about questioning our assumption and looking at how we can stretch the envelope. I think Flutter does exactly that, and Flutter's primary hypothesis is that, hey, why do you need all of these different rendering layers in Android if you can just go directly draw it to the GL layer or directly draw it to the graphics system, right? And that's what makes Flutter great, because basically what you do is your Dart commands are taken and written to Flutter. And it does it in a synchronous way. Now, that's one of the really interesting things that Flutter offers. And I think Kudo's experiment with React Native is a very good way to figure out how can we combine the ease of development in terms of declarative UI. So some of the good things about React is that it's easy to reason about. The UI is declarative. With things like hooks, you know that, hey, this is the functional part of it versus this is the part where I have a side effect on my component, stuff like that. So this whole developer-friendly developer mindset is taken to the performance area where you're like, hey, now that I've taken care of developer experience, let me also take care of user experience. So I think it's a pretty good exploration. I'm not a great fan of like comparing React Native versus Flutter. I know that the JavaScript community kind of likes drama and tries to say which one is better. Personally, I think that there is like really good things in both React Native and Flutter, and we are starting to learn from each other so well. So in terms of performance, I think like I'm super excited about this whole idea of synchronous, and it's not about like synchronous versus asynchronous. We are now coming to a world that we have realized that both of them are equally important. If you want to respond quickly to user actions, you need to draw synchronously. On the other hand, if something you're waiting for from a network takes you a second, adding 100 millisecond delay is not going to like prevent you from anything. So this whole idea of synchronous and asynchronous as and when needed to ensure that your focus is on user experience, I think that's what excites me about like this whole idea of like React Native Skia and doing it in the synchronous way.
Yeah, I would like to echo that it is a little bit of apples and oranges. They are not necessarily the same thing. And there's obviously always trade-offs involved. If you want to reliably build for multiple platforms with a single code base, with thinking a little less about the specific platform intrinsic details, then that seems more of a case for Flutter than it is React Native. With React Native, as I've said and Ram also said, we always want people to actually put in the extra work to make sure that an application is absolutely adheres to the design guidelines that go into a platform. If I were to build an application and I would not need to think about constraints such as like immediately deploy to all these platforms, then that would probably be a reason for me to stick with React Native, because I really like using those native UIs rather than custom drawn ones. Also, and I'm not familiar in there's no need for me to use Flutter, so I haven't used it today. But I actually quite like with React Native how there's a kind of a hard constraint between the UI code and some of the native aspects. Where with our older Objective-C applications, it's over time in terms of maintenance, it just is always a little easy to do something a little easier where you access code that should be accessed from a different thread in a different place. And I like with React Native how that's just, you have to write a little bit of a boundary thing, which makes you think about that and keeps them separate more. So I'm not necessarily looking for a solution where I can do everything natively from a different language. That's how some people view it, I would say.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And actually, when you were mentioning, since you brought that up, it reminded me of an interesting use case that I know one of the leading automotive companies has. They are essentially just using Flutter for kind of developing for their custom hardware, and what they are using is they are just able to kind of back Flutter directly into their hardware and just have it as a sort of native language, let's say. So for them, it perfectly makes sense that they can just make it run natively. So it makes me really, really, unhappy, because that brand is, one of my top favorites, and I wish they were using React Native, but it looks like I might need to change my brand then. But anyway, the last... Yeah, there's always a conclusion about cars at the end of the day, as you can see behind me. But going to the next question, actually, Eloy, that's the one, I guess for you, but I'm pretty sure that others might have some interesting insights here as well from the open source perspective. And we briefly talked about it before in terms of how do you maintain your fork, your platform, when you have to keep your code in sync with the master. And what I specifically would like to understand about it is how do you backport some of the features? So say code gen lands or is kind of turned on by default. How do you make sure that these features work with your fork? Do you have some sort of special syncing mechanism, or is it a very, very hard, manual, painful work? I just it would be great to understand how hard or how easy this might be for you on a daily basis.
Yes, it would be really great to understand. That is basically it. There's a gradient of solutions. When I look at what we have at Microsoft, which is React Native, macOS, React Native, Windows, but then also we have some specific patches, for instance, for Android. There's a few different systems. Like React Native Windows is most in sync right now. React Native macOS is most out of sync. React Native macOS currently just means, pulling all the changes from, that's what I'm doing right now, from 0.63 and then reapply, and I'm merging all our forked changes. And the forked changes are literally just, because iOS and macOS code in many cases is so similar, but it is not that easy to have them neatly factored out. They are in line with a lot of if-defs. Luckily, there's a lot of comments that demark those places, but it is a very manual process. The Android one, and also the Windows one, actually, is a little different, where they've extracted all these fork changes into a set of patches that is reapplied automatically whenever the upstream changes are pulled. But just also because macOS, the Windows version, has a little more budget. There's just people that are able to pull more on like a weekly basis, and it makes the whole thing maintainable. That doesn't mean that necessarily all features are used from upstream as is, right? So, well, for instance, at Microsoft, obviously, we use a lot of TypeScript instead of Flow. So the whole code gen aspect, we have a different parser for, which generates the intermediate representation that is then used to generate the native code. And then we also have currently in the Windows version, as that's being ported to the macOS version, a slightly different Turbo Modules API. But we're also in talks with Facebook to see if we can reconcile that back upstream. So, it goes in all directions. That doesn't necessarily always make it the easiest thing. But as we're working throughout it, over time, it becomes clear like how the future could look like for out-of-tree platforms. At some point, possibly iOS and Android could be considered treated the same way as out-of-tree platforms, where there's just a core of React Native, and then there's all the platform-specific implementations, and it goes, as you know, Mike, with to the CLI packages, to the native code, and it probably makes it a lot easier that way in the long term to do these things. But right now, it is definitely a lot of a manual process and figuring out together what should move where, as we try to keep that up to date. macOS is definitely, like I said, it's a little lagging behind because of how manual the process is.
Yeah, as you said, from the CLI perspective, we are already kind of doing this by having, iOS and Android commands to ship as a separate packages, which might be hard to describe here in this podcast. But all I wanted to say is that, sometimes I feel like React Native was so great from the conceptual perspective that the variety of out-of-tree platforms were faster to appear than the framework itself was ready for them. And I feel like we are working on that right now to make that, kind of easy for you and other people to integrate with. And I'm happy that from the CLI perspective, we are doing small changes, but I'm also kind of excited about the, destructuring of React Native into smaller packages. I think there's somebody working on that as well. So, exciting times ahead, I think, for out-of-tree platforms, or actually platforms, because I think somebody banned use out-of-tree at some point. So let's not use that, I think.
Yeah, I think in terms of like the simple example when it comes to abstracting things, right? It's like, so this iOS and macOS shared code, there would likely be a shared package that is Apple or whatever, Apple code. And then there would be an iOS out-of-tree or an iOS platform implementation and then macOS implementation that both rely on the shared one. And the same, I imagine, would happen with the CLI packages. Yeah.
So I think that's a great time to wrap up this sort of multi-platform part of our panel. And as I said, looks like we have exciting times up ahead. I can't wait for actually trying out macOS, React Native, and actually trying it Windows again. Back in the day, I only tried C# or C++, and that didn't turn out really well. So it might be a good time. So the last section with just a few basic questions about general React Native development. We can talk about new architecture, we can talk about multi-platform, but at the end of the day, we all create some kind of React Native code and we solve some maybe challenging or typical daily problems with React Native. So maybe we can start with that one. What was the biggest or the latest performance challenge or that you have faced at your job, and how did you solve that, and what were the takeaways from it? We can start with Ram.
Yeah, I was wondering, I mean, it's performance. There's no reason I wouldn't take it. So on the React Native performance part, I think, and this is also what prompted me to do the talk at React Native EU. I think the mistake I made was I kind of was talking about native performance and improving native performance over and over again. But one of the things that I realized is that there's also a ton of performance issues in the JavaScript side of the world. So the latest performance issue that I had was around JavaScript thread being super busy. And as you know, you can spawn many threads on the native side. There are a lot of solutions there, but on JavaScript, there is not much. And if your JavaScript thread is busy, if you click a button, it shows. You can actually see that the JavaScript button click does not go through. And I was trying to understand what happens. And I think to your question about what is the issue was the JavaScript thread was slow, and I had no clue how to solve it. I also discovered that the JavaScript profilers used to work with JSC and are broken on Hermes. And we have an internal tool that we were able to use to get the sampling profiler running. That's when I also realized that there's nothing exists in the open source. And luckily for me, we had the MLH fellowship program, which is a program to bring in new students and new contributors into React Native and get them to build stuff. I was actually super lucky to get into that the project got accepted into MLH, and we had two really talented students build the visualization for the Hermes sampling profiler in open source. So I'm hoping that just like me, if people are also facing issues with JavaScript performance, that's one tool that will come in handy that people can use and build.
Nice. And by the way, Ram, I have to say here that recently I've been working on the startup performance of my Android app, and I had an issue with React markers and systrace, and I found some articles of yours, describing how to set it up with some kind of custom code hosted on Gist, how to make it work. And I was just, so glad that you did the hard work before, because it was such a time saver. So I just wanted to thank you for doing this, as we are, talking about performance right now. All right, Monica, I think you wanted to say something as well about the challenge that you had in Major League Soccer. You're working on a product, I think, so there might be some interesting problems that you are facing every day.
Yeah, there are actually multiple performance, gaps and challenges that we are faced with all the time. But the one that when I was thinking about this question, that it came up to my mind, because it's I guess the most challenging that we have had in the recent time has been our massive upgrade of our app. We were, just trying to migrate to Android X, which again, sounds to be something way behind, but because we have a lot of libraries that we depend on and so much of native code, we were just recently doing it. And after doing this, just the upgrading of some of our major libraries, like React Navigation, for instance, made the process of migrating overall very challenging, especially because we had some libraries that were already considered legacy code and had kind of changed everything internally. So this particularly forced us to think about ways to solve issues like total incompatibility with the new APIs, right? So the whole process, which led us to have great increases in performance, was definitely something that every person who's developing in native always has to face. And I think it was important to bring it up here, because we also face it at MLS, having a bunch of engineers working on it and just being an app that we have developed for quite a long time already.
Yeah, totally agree. And actually this, I think, brings me to the next question, which I can ask you as well as a follow-up from the migration perspective, because there is a lot of companies are migrating to React Native right now from a variety of different apps. small ones and big ones, one platform, many platforms, and they are also trying to transition from native developers to JavaScript developers, which is also a challenge on its own. So I guess my question would be, what would be the biggest challenge that you would say might be here, and what would be the advice for somebody who's looking to start doing this as we speak?
And you mean to start like building up React Native applications?
Yeah, just trying to migrate from the existing apps to React Native. So you say you have like two or maybe like you have an app, native app, and you're about to migrate it. So that's a intermediate brownfield app that's eventually gonna be greenfield, hopefully when they are ready.
Oh, there are many things that we have to take into account, but I think dividing the process in chunks is perhaps the smartest thing to do, as well as determining compatibility from the libraries and like all of the parts of your app with, in this case, React Native, but everything that we're trying to develop. Sometimes, and what we have found out so far is like, of course, React Native is amazing and we love working with it, but there are things that are still we need to kind of like tweak and move around so we are compatible with some of the libraries for third-party providers that are not working with a React Native mind. And then this kind of goes with what Ram and Kudo were talking before about, like, they don't, and I guess everybody, they're not, all the libraries are not just like the same thing competing for the same. And in other languages as well, just like, so I guess understanding what are the limitations and capabilities of like the libraries that you have on the native side, and then what are the limitations and capabilities that React Native offers is like a perfect starting point for everything.
Yeah, I would agree definitely with that. When we started converting the Artsy app, I think for a lot of people it is very tempting to want to think about JavaScriptifying all of it as soon as possible, but that I would say that is not really necessary, and you can probably focus on other things first. Also, there's some cases where you, depending on the company, where you will want to keep native code anyways, and which actually, this conversion, the RC app, is so long ago that I don't know how much it really applies to technically to companies nowadays. Actually, that is my React Native EU talk about, so you can just look that up on YouTube. But it's more interesting, I think. I don't know if you were hinting at that, Mike, but obviously it's not just a technological thing, right? It's working with people, with developers, and I've had many conversations with companies where they try or they consider introducing React Native, and we actually, now that we're talking about it, actually remember from Artsy, a few people did a conference at Facebook, a small conference, which is Artsy X React Native on YouTube, and my colleague Maxime did a great talk about learning how to learn, which is more about the psychology of developers that and considering that aspect, as she was, when I introduced React Native, and how I did not necessarily truly considered all of the aspects, how that affects a native engineer, how they suddenly are dropped into something new, how their specific skills are, or how do they fit in. I think in the end, at Artsy, that was a good mix where we now have the ability to have a lot more people working, more product teams working on the application, but we definitely always tried to embed a native expert into each of these teams to ensure that we have the quality that we're looking for. But it's not something that you can just take for granted or just consider like, oh, yeah, it's easy win budget-wise, let's just switch to JavaScript. That's probably a recipe for disaster if you have a larger team of native developers.
Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with that as well. Actually, this is something that we run many times when we are working with clients. They're about to do this transition. Technology is one thing, but then trying to kind of get into the existing organization where there are native developers, different teams. For first, you have to sell them React Native as well and kind of demonstrate the benefits of that, and this becomes a challenging task on its own. So I guess as soon as everybody's on board, you can say that you have some kind of success already achieved. Cool. So I think that's it from the questions that we have received from the React Native EU. Obviously, there is still a lot of questions that we had. I think we had more than 100, and I decided to group them into smaller talk-oriented questions, and every speaker receives them in an email. So we will be working on them in a follow-up. And if we were about to answer 100 questions here, we would probably have to spend the whole day, which would be impossible given the time zone differences we have here. So I guess that brings us to the end of our panel. And I wanted to thank you very much for joining. And I know that you are all from different places from the world. So we have we have Ram where it's 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. right now. Kudo, that's probably like just minutes before midnight, and the rest of us is kind of somewhere in between. So it's been a really challenging thing to pull off, and I'm really happy that we made it. So all I wanted to say is thank you for taking part in this podcast. I hope that you liked it, and yeah, just thank you for being part of this, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again, maybe on a podcast as well.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mike. Looking forward to seeing you all again as well. And perhaps consider still some online as components, even if at some point conferences do go live again.
Yeah, well, for what it's worth, I think, one thing is that we've been recently talking together a lot because we are working on some crazy stuff. So I'm hoping that, we might have some pair programming like this more often rather than just talking, because, it always makes me happy to see faces and to speak with developers, because we kind of write 99% of time, and then it is so stressful experience for me to talk with you because, we don't talk often, like we usually write. So there's a lot of, sort of information coming, like the face, the smile, the gestures. So it's pretty fun experience, but yeah, we should do it more often for sure. Okay, thank you once again, and hoping to see you again really soon.